What if the person you just married wasn't who you thought they were? Would you confront them, expose their lies, or would their deadly secret end up costing you your life? Tobias, a young, ambitious 22-year-old, thought his whirlwind romance with Delilah, a glamorous 60-year-old widow, was his ticket to a life of adventure and security. But on their honeymoon in a remote villa in Bali, Tobias uncovers a horrifying truth about his bride's dark past. A confrontation leads to a deadly game of manipulation, betrayal, and survival that ends in murder. Stick around as we unravel the shocking events that turned their dream honeymoon into a nightmare. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss this intense story. Tobias Carter was 22, eager to leave behind the suffocating monotony of his life in Atlanta. A struggling college dropout, he dreamed of escape, of finding someone who could offer him adventure and stability. That's when he met Delilah Stones, a stunning 60-year-old widow with a quiet charm and a bank account that seemed bottomless. They met by chance at a small art gallery downtown. Tobias had been working part-time as a barista at the event, pouring drinks for wealthy patrons, when Delilah caught his eye. Her presence was magnetic. She wore a sleek black dress and carried herself with an effortless elegance that turned heads. "Your taste in art is far more refined than the coffee you're serving," she teased when Tobias struck up a conversation. Their banter was playful, her smile disarming, and before long Tobias found himself swept up in her world. She had a way of making him feel special, listened to, even admired. For a young man who had spent most of his life trying to prove his worth, Delilah was intoxicating. Their romance moved quickly. Within 3 months, Delilah had invited Tobias to move into her luxury penthouse, a stark contrast to the cramped apartment he shared with 2 roommates. They traveled together, dining at exclusive restaurants and attending high-society events. For Tobias, it felt like stepping into a dream. Delilah, however, was careful about what she revealed about herself. She spoke little of her past, deflecting questions about her late husband and childhood with vague responses. Tobias, infatuated, didn't press her. She had an air of mystery that he found irresistible, but there were moments that Tobias couldn't ignore. Delilah occasionally disappeared for hours without explanation, returning with a strained look in her eyes. And one night, when Tobias accidentally knocked over a small wooden box in her closet, she snapped. "Don't touch my things," she said sharply, her tone colder than he had ever heard it. Tobias apologized, brushing it off as a misunderstanding, but the incident lingered in his mind. What was in the box that made her so defensive? Despite the small red flags, Tobias proposed after only 5 months of dating. Delilah accepted with a coy smile, telling him he had brought excitement back into her life. Their wedding was intimate, a quiet ceremony at a private estate. Tobias's mother, skeptical of the relationship, voiced her concerns. "You barely know her," she said. "Something doesn't feel right." Tobias dismissed her worries, chalking it up to jealousy or judgment over Delilah's age. But as the plane touched down in Bali for their honeymoon, the doubts he had pushed aside began creeping back in. The honeymoon villa in Bali was breathtaking, a secluded paradise surrounded by lush greenery and turquoise waters. Delilah had spared no expense, ensuring their trip was nothing short of luxurious. For Tobias, it should have been a dream come true. Yet, as the days went on, unease began to creep into his mind. Delilah's behavior shifted almost immediately. She was still affectionate, but her calm demeanor gave way to a subtle edginess. Small things seemed to irritate her. Tobias's questions about her late husband, his interest in exploring the villa alone, even his casual jokes. One afternoon, while Delilah lounged on the patio with a glass of wine, Tobias wandered into her room to grab sunscreen. As he searched her dresser, he noticed something strange, an old photograph partially hidden under a silk scarf. In the photo, a much younger Delilah stood beside a man and a teenage boy, both of them fair-skinned with a striking resemblance to each other. Her face was hard to read. Was it fear? Defiance? Before Tobias could inspect it further, Delilah appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. Tobias froze. "I was just looking for sunscreen," he said, trying to sound casual. Her eyes darted to the photograph. Without a word, she crossed the room, snatched it from his hand, and stuffed it into her pocket. "Next time, ask," she said coldly before walking out. That night, Delilah was quiet at dinner, sipping her wine while Tobias tried to lighten the mood, but her sharp gaze lingered on him, as if she were sizing him up. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Who?" Tobias asked, intrigued. Delilah smiled faintly. "Just someone from a long time ago. It doesn't matter." Her vague response only deepened Tobias's curiosity. The photograph, her sudden shift in demeanor. It all felt off. On the third night of their honeymoon, Tobias awoke to find Delilah missing from their bed. The villa was eerily silent as he wandered through the rooms, searching for her. When he stepped onto the patio, he saw her sitting by the pool, staring into the distance with an empty expression. As she turned and noticed him, she smiled faintly as if nothing was wrong. "Go back to bed, darling," she said softly. But Tobias couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. The next day, while Delilah was out at the spa, Tobias searched the villa. He found her luggage tucked away in the closet and, buried beneath layers of designer clothes, the same small wooden box he'd seen back in her penthouse. It was locked, but the scratches around the keyhole suggested it had been opened and closed countless times. Tobias's heart raced as he considered breaking into it. What was Delilah hiding, and why did he feel like he was suddenly in over his head? Tobias sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small wooden box in his hands. The scratches around the lock told him this wasn't an ordinary keepsake. It was something Delilah had opened and closed many times, and whatever was inside, she didn't want anyone else to see. His curiosity burned, but without a key, he had no way to open it. Frustrated, he placed the box back in its hiding spot and decided to approach things carefully. He needed to understand who he had married, and he knew Delilah wouldn't willingly offer answers. That evening, Delilah seemed unusually calm as they dined by candlelight, the ocean breeze brushing past the terrace. Tobias brought up the photograph he had found days earlier, carefully treading the line between curiosity and accusation. "Who was the boy in that picture?" he asked casually, swirling his drink. Delilah froze for a split second, just long enough for Tobias to notice. Then she smiled. "My nephew," she said smoothly. "He passed away years ago. It's not something I like to talk about." Tobias nodded, pretending to accept the explanation, but something about the way she avoided his gaze unsettled him. Her tone was too polished, too rehearsed. The breakthrough came the next morning. Delilah had left for a spa session in town, leaving Tobias alone in the villa. As he tidied up the living room, his foot nudged something under the couch. Bending down, he retrieved a small leather envelope, its flap slightly torn. Inside, he found a folded stack of faded documents, a death certificate, an adoption record, and a police report. His hands trembled as he read through them. The death certificate belonged to a man named Samuel Hayes, Delilah's late husband. The cause of death was listed as drowning, but what caught Tobias's attention was the police report. It described the incident in chilling detail. Samuel had died in their pool, but there were inconsistencies. Witnesses had reported an argument between him and Delilah earlier that evening, and bruising on his body suggested foul play. The adoption record was even more shocking. Tobias realized that the teenage boy in the photo wasn't Delilah's nephew. He was her adopted son, Benjamin Hayes. And the record revealed something even darker. Benjamin had gone missing 2 years after Samuel's death. Tobias's chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. Delilah had lied about everything. Her husband's drowning wasn't an accident, and now her son had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. When Delilah returned that evening, Tobias couldn't hold back. "I found something," he said, standing in the living room as she walked in. Delilah tilted her head, her smile unshaken. "Oh? And what's that?" He held up the envelope, his voice trembling. "This. Samuel didn't just drown, did he? And Benjamin, he wasn't your nephew. He was your son." Delilah's smile faltered for the first time, and her eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't have gone through my things, Tobias." "Then tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice rising. "What happened to them? What did you do?" Delilah stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "You're digging into things that don't concern you." Tobias took a step back, his heart pounding. "I married you. I deserve to know who you really are." Delilah stared at him for a long moment before her lips curled into a faint smile. "Be careful, Tobias," she said softly. "Some secrets are better left buried." Tobias couldn't sleep. Delilah's cryptic warning played over and over in his mind. Some secrets are better left buried. But he couldn't leave it alone. The documents had confirmed his worst fears. Samuel and Benjamin's fates were tied to Delilah's past. He was sure the wooden box held the missing piece of the puzzle. Delilah fell asleep early that night, her breathing soft and steady as the moonlight spilled across the room. Tobias sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the perfect moment. Once he was sure she was sound asleep, he slipped out quietly and retrieved the box from her luggage. Armed with a butter knife from the villa's kitchen, he worked on the lock. His hands trembled as the blade slipped into the scratched keyhole. After several tense minutes, the lock popped open with a quiet click. Inside, Tobias found a collection of items: old photographs, handwritten letters, and a single gold ring engraved with the initials B.H. Benjamin Hayes. His throat tightened as he pulled out the letters, each one addressed to Delilah in a scrawled, uneven hand. The letters painted a chilling picture. Benjamin had written to Delilah shortly before his disappearance, begging for her forgiveness. One letter stood out, dated just a week before he went missing. "Mom, I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean to hurt you, but I can't stay here anymore. I'm scared of what you'll do if I tell someone about Dad. Please, just let me go. I won't tell anyone. I promise." Tobias's breath hitched as he read the words. Benjamin had known what happened to Samuel. He had tried to leave, but Delilah hadn't let him. Another letter, written in a firmer hand, chilled Tobias to the bone. "Benjamin needs to disappear. If you can't handle it, I will. Call me when you're ready to do what has to be done." The letter was signed with a single initial, D. Tobias's mind raced. Who was this person? A friend? An accomplice? Either way, the implication was horrifying. Delilah had conspired with someone to cover up Benjamin's disappearance. The sound of footsteps startled Tobias. He turned sharply to see Delilah standing in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway light. Delilah froze in the doorway when she saw Tobias holding the open box, its contents laid bare on the floor. For a moment, her face was unreadable, her eyes darting to the scattered letters and photographs. But instead of yelling or reacting with anger, she took a deep breath and softened her expression. "Tobias," she said, her voice calm and steady. "What are you doing with that?" Tobias stood rigid, clutching the box to his chest. "I know what you did, Delilah," he said, his voice trembling. "I know about Samuel, about Benjamin. You killed them, didn't you?" Delilah's expression didn't falter. Instead, she let out a soft sigh and leaned against the door frame, her calmness unnerving. "You've gotten yourself all worked up over nothing," she said, shaking her head. "You don't understand what you're looking at." Tobias frowned. "Don't lie to me. I read Benjamin's letters. He was scared of you." Her lips curved into a faint, almost pitying smile. "He was scared because he made mistakes, Tobias. But this isn't the time to talk about the past. You shouldn't have gone through my things, but I'll forgive you." Tobias's stomach churned. "Forgive me," he snapped. "You're insane, Delilah. I'm leaving." "Leave," she said, arching a brow. "Where will you go in the middle of the night? This villa is isolated, surrounded by cliffs and jungle. Be reasonable, Tobias." Her calm demeanor made him hesitate. He expected her to scream, to lash out, but she didn't. She simply stood there, composed, as if she already knew she had the upper hand. "Go back to bed," Delilah said softly, stepping into the room. "You're tired, and you're letting your imagination get the better of you. We'll talk about this in the morning." Tobias stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Her sudden shift in tone threw him off balance, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if she was telling the truth. "I'll make breakfast," Delilah added, her voice warm now, "and we'll figure all of this out, together." Still gripping the box, Tobias backed toward the bed. He didn't trust her, but he had no choice. If she was planning something, he'd need his strength to survive it. The next morning, Delilah set the stage. The dining table was perfectly arranged, an elaborate breakfast spread laid out, like a peace offering. When Tobias hesitated to sit, she smiled sweetly. "Let's start over," she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. "You'll feel better after you eat." The morning sun streamed into the villa as Delilah set the breakfast table with an air of calm efficiency. Tobias sat stiffly across from her, watching her every move. The spread was impressive: freshly baked bread, tropical fruits, and a steaming pot of coffee. "You didn't sleep well," Delilah said, pouring coffee into Tobias's cup. "You look exhausted." Tobias didn't respond. His eyes flicked to the steaming coffee, then back to her, his instinct screaming not to trust her. Delilah sat down and took a sip from her own cup, her movements deliberate. "I know you're scared, Tobias, but you don't have to be. I meant it when I said we could work through this together." Tobias hesitated but reached for the coffee, desperate for a moment of normalcy. The bitter liquid slid down his throat, and for a moment he felt himself relax, but within minutes his body betrayed him. His vision blurred, and his muscles began to weaken. Panic surged through him as he looked up at Delilah, who sat watching him with cold detachment. What did you do?" Tobias gasped, clutching at his throat. Delilah leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "You never should have opened that box, darling. You didn't know what you were getting into." Tobias collapsed onto the floor, his breath shallow and labored as the world around him darkened. Delilah calmly set her coffee cup down, standing to watch him take his final breaths. Delilah worked quickly. She dragged Tobias's lifeless body to the edge of the villa's property, where the cliffs overlooked the ocean. After wrapping him in a spare bedsheet, she rolled him over the edge, watching as the waves swallowed him whole. Back in the villa, she cleaned meticulously. Every trace of Tobias's presence, the coffee cup, the chair he sat in, even his suitcase, was wiped down or disposed of. She took the wooden box and its incriminating contents, including Benjamin's phone, and smashed them into pieces before burning them in the villa's outdoor fire pit. By the time she finished, the villa looked as pristine as it had the day they arrived. To anyone else, Tobias had simply vanished. Later that afternoon, Delilah called the villa's concierge with a carefully rehearsed story. "My husband went for a morning walk and hasn't come back," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "I think he might have gotten lost or fallen. Please send someone to help." Her performance was flawless. As local authorities arrived to investigate, Delilah played the role of the grieving widow, clutching Tobias's wedding ring as she tearfully recounted his supposed love of adventure. "I told him not to wander off alone," she said, dabbing at her dry eyes with a handkerchief. "But he never listens." The search for Tobias lasted 3 days, but the rough waves and rocky terrain surrounding the villa yielded no answers. Local authorities filed it as a probable accident, a tourist wandering too close to the cliffs. Delilah, with her carefully crafted grief, had given them no reason to suspect otherwise. But Officer Mateo wasn't convinced. During his interviews with Delilah, he noticed inconsistencies in her story. She had claimed Tobias left early for his walk, but the villa staff reported not seeing him that morning. Mateo also found it odd how eager she was to leave Bali, pressing to end her honeymoon trip due to heartbreak before the investigation could fully conclude. When Mateo quietly requested Delilah's background through international channels, the pieces began to fall into place. He discovered a disturbing pattern. Samuel Hayes, her previous husband, had drowned under suspicious circumstances years ago. Her adopted son, Benjamin, had vanished soon after. Combined with the discovery of Tobias's burned belongings in the villa's fire pit, Mateo had enough to request further action. Back in Atlanta, Delilah was settling back into her glamorous life when the FBI knocked on her door. "We're reopening investigations into the deaths of your husband and son, as well as the disappearance of Tobias Carter. Please come with us." Delilah's mask of composure cracked for the first time. "This is absurd," she protested. "Tobias's death was a tragic accident. I had nothing to do with it." But the evidence was mounting. Forensic divers in Bali recovered remnants of Benjamin's phone from the ocean floor. GPS data from Tobias's missing phone placed him at the villa the morning he died, contradicting Delilah's timeline. The authorities also unearthed a key witness, an ex-housekeeper of Delilah's, who revealed suspicious details about Samuel's death. During the trial, prosecutors painted Delilah as a manipulative killer who eliminated anyone who became a liability. They connected the dots between Samuel's drowning, Benjamin's disappearance, and Tobias's death, presenting her history of lies and cover-ups. The defense argued there was no physical evidence tying Delilah to the crimes, but the jury found her cold demeanor and lack of remorse damning. When recordings of Benjamin's desperate messages to Darla surfaced in court, the final nail was driven into Delilah's case. Delilah was convicted of second-degree murder in Tobias's death, as well as accessory charges for her role in Benjamin's disappearance. She received 30 years to life in prison. Tobias's mother, devastated but determined, vowed to honor her son's memory. She established a foundation to support victims of domestic manipulation and raise awareness about red flags in abusive relationships. Delilah, now a shadow of her former self, spent her days in prison insisting on her innocence to anyone who would listen. But the world finally saw her for what she truly was, a calculated murderer who had run out of lies. And that's the story of Delilah, the 60-year-old bride whose deadly secrets led to her undoing. What do you think? Could Tobias have escaped his fate? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one.